Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we get started with today's episode, I just want to let you know that this is going to be the last episode of 2025. I'm taking just a little bit of a break for the last 2 weeks of December, so I will be back in January with all new episodes for you for 2026. And as we wrap up this year, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of you out there for listening, for sharing episodes with friends, with colleagues, with teachers, and all of your support for the podcast. It has been wild, the growth of the podcast this last year, and I hope to see that continue. And I just want to say a huge thank you to you for being part of this podcasting community. All right, today we're going to talk about how to maximize your winter break, and in terms of training plans, rest, recovery, all of that. This week's podcast topic was actually a request from a dancer who reached out and said, hey, I'm in my first year of a university or college, I actually don't know where they go to school, but a college dance program, and I have a really long winter break for the first time ever. So this, I believe, is a dancer who came from a studio environment, has moved on into a college dance program, and now has over a month off with the way the dates fall for the winter break. And so they reached out asking, what should I be doing, or how can I maximize my training during this time? Because when they go back in January, they're going to be expected to, still be in shape and be able to kind of hit the ground running and be able to dance intense hours. Most of these college dance programs have a lot of hours of dancing in a week. So I loved this podcast sort of request or suggestion. And so that's what we're going to dive into today. Before we get into kind of how to maximize our winter break, I did an episode last year right around the exact same time. It was episode 60, and it is called Winter Break Training Plans for Dancers. So if you've not listened to that episode, definitely go back and listen to that one as well. I will link it in the show notes. And especially if you are a studio dancer or even a professional dancer, but somebody who has a shorter winter break. So let's say 2 weeks or less, I would really encourage you to actually go listen to episode 60. Today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on our dancers who have a longer break. And I realize that this is not the majority of dancers, but this is probably most college and university level dancers. They often end up with a slightly longer break over the winter than what we would typically see in a studio setting. So I'm going to dive into the other stuff just a little bit, but if you want more information about a shorter winter break, definitely go check out episode 60. I will put it in the show notes. So what do we want to do to maximize our winter break training plans? Should we be focusing on rest and recovery? Should we be training? Should we be yada, yada, yada? It's a great question. It actually does come up quite often. And in my area, what I've seen popping up a lot is these one-off days of training being offered throughout the winter break. So, say the break is 2 weeks long, on the days that aren't holidays, so not Christmas, not Boxing Day, not New Year's, those types of days, there are people who are offering kind of workshop-y type days, so a day of come in and train and what have you. And a lot of times it's being billed as, don't get out of shape, keep up your training, don't lose momentum, whatever that sort of verbiage is that they are using. And although I appreciate the sentiment behind it, and in some of these cases, it's actually a great opportunity to train with maybe teachers that you've never trained with before, or be able to do a workshop in styles that you maybe don't train in super regularly. So I do understand the appeal of offering these. And quite honestly, I think most of the time this is being offered because teachers need to make a living. And a lot of teachers, if they have 2 full weeks off over the break, they are not making any income. Teachers don't get paid an annual salary generally. They are paid for the hours they teach. And so I do think a lot of the time these offerings come up a little bit out of necessity from a financial perspective. And I 100% understand and get that. But if your winter break is relatively short, and by that I mean kind of 2 weeks or less, the main focus of your break really should be on rest and recovery. And if you want to know more about what I mean when I say rest and recovery and the types of things we can and should be doing, check out episode 9 of the podcast. I did an entire podcast episode on rest and recovery, so I'll link that in the show notes as well. It gives you really concrete examples of what types of things you can be doing. Because we can just say like rest, but that doesn't always just mean like sitting in front of the TV and watching endless Hallmark movies, although quite frankly, I fully support watching endless Hallmark movies. So go check out that episode if you want to know more about that. So, like I said, if your break is relatively short, our main focus should be on rest and recovery. I also know that for some of our dancers, and especially studio dancers, one of the reasons there's training being offered, and sometimes it's private lessons, and sometimes it's rehearsals, and sometimes it's these workshops, but there is training being offered because a lot of dancers have an event, whether that is a performance or a competition. More often than not, it's a competition that is happening almost immediately right after the break ends. And so teachers, maybe rightfully so, don't want dancers doing absolutely nothing for the entire break and then all of a sudden having to go into an intense weekend of competition. And so again, there are situations where maybe a dancer does need to be dancing to some degree. The timing of competitions right at the beginning of January still really irks me. Like, why competition organizers and owners are still choosing to do that really makes no sense to me. But that is an aside in a totally different episode. So there are instances where dancers may need to be training during the break. Again, I cover this a bit more in last year's episode. So episode 60, last year, talking about winter break training plans for dancers. If you're in that situation where you're like, I have a competition that is the week after break ends, what should I be doing? Go listen to that episode. We cover that a little bit more. What I want to dive into today is if we have a longer break. So if our break is more than 2 weeks, and especially if it's like 3 to 4 weeks long, or even I've heard about people having breaks even longer than that. 4 weeks seems to be about the longest that most of the dancers I work with regularly are experiencing. But I do know with timing of maybe when your final exams end and then when classes return back and things like that, that sometimes these dancers are going to have a break that is more than 4 weeks even. But anywhere in that, let's just say more than 2 weeks. How do we maximize that type of a break to make sure that there is some focus on rest and recovery, but that we are also not getting deconditioned? Because that's everyone's main focus, right? Or main concern, I should say. People don't want to get, air quotes, out of shape or deconditioned by having a break. And again, if our break is short, if our break is less than 2 weeks, we are not going to lose conditioning. That is not a concern, which is why our focus should be on rest and recovery. If our break is longer, then this can potentially become a bit of a concern. So we need to figure out how to balance rest and recovery with, conditioning and making sure that we are ready to go back into classes come January or whenever it is that classes start again. So how do we approach it? My recommendation is always to treat the first part of the break. So let's say the first 2 weeks. I'm going to assume that somebody has about 4 weeks off. So you're going to have to adjust this, give or take, depending on how long your break is. But I'm just going to kind of assume that people have about 4 weeks off in this scenario. The first 2-ish weeks, we want to focus on rest and recovery. And again, that doesn't always mean doing absolutely nothing. We can be focusing on some, active recovery type modalities. But for the most part, that is going to look like a lot of rest and, some passive recovery. Check out episode 9 if you want to learn more about rest and recovery. But the first 2 weeks of that break, we're going to focus on rest and recovery. Then we want to start to think about, okay, how do I get myself back into kind of dance mode, or how do I get myself back into a level which I can go into a 30 or 40 hour training week in my dance program and not be dying in the first week back. So we want to think about increasing our training a little bit gradually over the next, we'll call it 2 weeks. In your case, it might be 10 days, it might be 2.5 weeks, it might be whatever. For a lot of dancers, and actually the dancer who reached out with this kind of podcast request was also concerned because they did not have access to dance classes over their break. So they live in a smaller community. They sort of said, I'm not going to be able to take any classes. How do I maximize my training time? Or what do I do when I can't actually go and take class because there isn't anything offered in my area? So we're going to, play out a few different scenarios. So if you do not have access to classes, there are still things that we can do to make sure that our body is appropriately conditioned to return back to the studio. And even if you do have access to classes, a lot of dancers need a mental break from the studio at this time of year. And so I think you can absolutely go through your entire winter break and not take a single class and be totally fine if we're preparing in other ways. So the other ways that we want to prepare, or what we want to focus on, is cardiovascular conditioning and strength and mobility work. And I throw mobility in with the strength work because a lot of dancers are like, okay, so I'm just going to make sure I do lots of stretching over the winter break. And that's not what I'm talking about. We generally don't need to do a ton of stretching, or at least a ton of passive stretching, when we're thinking about how do we keep our body sort of mobile and flexible. We want to think more about mobility work, and that often pairs nicely with gym work or strength work, or just strength and mobility work at home if you don't have access to a gym. So when you first start back, we don't want to go super, super hard back-to-back days, like really kind of taxing your body super aggressively. We're going to start back with some moderate level cardiovascular activity. And that could be stationary cycling. It could be running. It could be walking vigorously, maybe if we have access to a treadmill or something. And so we can use like an incline and we can kind of like tax ourselves a little bit more. Just walking outdoors is often not enough of a cardiovascular challenge for it to have a training effect for dancers, unless you're really consciously trying to do hill repeats or something like that. But stationary cycling, it could be swimming. It could be like stair climbing at home if you don't have access to a gym, or maybe you live in a super snowy place and so riding a bike outside is like not an option, and you have stairs at home. We can do, stair type workouts. There's lots of ways of getting cardiovascular activity in. And so we want to start to include some of that at a moderate level. We're not going to go in super, super light. It's not like you've had an entire summer off. You've had a couple weeks of rest and recovery. You're going to come back to that cardiovascular activity at what we would consider a moderate level. We're then going to intersperse that with some strength and mobility work. So in terms of like, what does that look like overall? I would generally recommend that people are doing between 3 and 5 days of training per week for the second half of that break. So in the case of our, fantasy 4-week winter break, the second 2 weeks of that, you're going to do 3 to 5 days of training. So maybe the first week you do 3 days that first week because you're sort of slowly starting to get into it. And that could be a combination of cardio and strength and mobility work all on the same day and then having rest days in between. Or if you like to split that work up, that is totally fine as well. And you could do cardiovascular work on 3 days and then have strength work interspersed. So maybe you're actually doing more days consecutively, but you're focusing on different body systems and different energy systems. And then the second week of that break, maybe we're increasing it to 5 days. And so again, combo of cardio, strength, mobility all on one day, or split up a little bit more, but getting more into that sort of 5 days, but still having a couple of rest and recovery days so that we're not just like, going 7 days a week for those final 2 weeks, and then you're coming back into your program already a little bit physically exhausted. So it's a balancing act of, challenging ourselves so that we know that we're like actually having some conditioning type effects and actually achieving something, but not exhausting yourself so much that you're not also getting the benefits of the winter break and having a little bit of time for rest and recovery. If you have access to dance classes and that is one of the things you want to incorporate into your training, that's great. And a lot of people who go back home over the winter break, they do want to take classes because they might have favorite teachers that they haven't seen, friends they want to connect with who are also coming home from different programs all over the, country or internationally even. So taking class is totally, totally fine. And you can kind of incorporate that into that sort of second half of your winter break. Again, we don't want to take class 7 days a week. 3 to 5 days a week is still going to be adequate, but you can put class in there if you want. Class does not fully replace either cardiovascular training or strength work. So we ideally, in an ideal world, still want to incorporate some of those things. But say you want to take class twice a week while you're home because it's your favorite teacher, whatever, you could be doing class twice a week. And then on 2 to maybe 3 other days, you could be doing some of this cardiovascular and strength work as well. And you're still going to have days of full rest and recovery where you're not actually doing anything in terms of like training, quote unquote. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of like how you could structure your break when it is longer, because we still want to make sure that we're prioritizing rest and recovery. Because let's face it, especially college dance programs are really, really intense. You're dancing 30, 40 hours a week, probably even more by the time you have rehearsals and things like that. So we do want to make sure that then we are prioritizing rest and recovery, but also then gradually increasing back into the training. When I say gradual, because I feel like I just thrown that out like a bunch of times, one of the things that we will sometimes use in sports science / dance science is something called the acute chronic workload ratio. I think I've talked about this on the podcast in the past and potentially in that rest and recovery podcast. It may also have been in episode 26, which is called Tips for Tapering in Dance. And in that episode, we talk about kind of a little bit of periodization and how you use tapering to maximize your performance. I may have talked about it in that episode as well. But essentially what the acute chronic workload ratio is it is looking at the amount of quote unquote work, so workload basically, that you have done over a prolonged period of time. And we usually use 4 weeks because it's easy, but it can be, sometimes we can use different measurements of that. And then we look at the amount of workload we're doing in the acute phase. And so that's usually measured in a 1 week period of time. And we look at what that ratio is. And we want that ratio to be somewhere between 0.8 and 1.2 or 1.3 for it to sort of be kind of optimal in terms of loading. If we're getting below 0.8, we would consider that to be underloading. And so the dancer may not be prepared to like meet the demands of what it is that they're about to do. And if that number goes above 1.5, that would be considered overloading. And in both of those areas, we know that that puts the dancer at increased risk of injury. I realize I'm talking through this really fast, and this is maybe like a little bit of a complicated topic. Perhaps I will do a podcast episode entirely on this concept in the future. But all of this is just to say that we want to make sure that we're not seeing really sudden spikes in training load. And so we can kind of look at this ratio of, okay, like how much have I been doing over the last 4 weeks? And how much am I doing this week? And is there a vast discrepancy in that, or is it sort of fairly aligned? When we have a break, so say we've taken 2 weeks off, that's going to really decrease our workload in that chronic workload kind of number. And so when we look at, okay, what is our acute workload? What are we doing this week? That's where that sort of gradual increase needs to come in. So we don't want to go from doing 0 hours to doing 40 hours with there being no kind of buffering or bridging in between. So when we say gradually increase, that is the reason that we are trying to gradually increase, is to make sure that that acute chronic workload ratio stays somewhere in the neighborhood of 1, or realistically 0.8 to 1.2 or 1.3, somewhere in there. So, like I said, a little bit of a complicated concept, also a little bit controversial when it comes to actually like the actual sports science behind it, but we do still use it a little bit in the dance world because it gives us a little bit of information in terms of how we can think about gradually increasing dancers. So that is what I'm going to say about how we can spend our time when we have this longer break. The other thing I want to touch on today in terms of maximizing our winter break is if we're dealing with any type of injury or aches or pains or niggles or things like that, this is a good time to address some of these, and really the way you're going to be able to maximize and get the most out of your winter break. More often than not, what we see or what I see clinically is dancers utilize their break, their winter break, to sort of rest and hope that whatever it was that was bothering them is just magically going to disappear. So dancers will kind of limp their way, like figuratively speaking, into the winter break, and they'll be like, oh yeah, my hip's been really sore and I've had like a foot thing that's kind of been bothering me. I can get through. I've been, just managing it, let's say. And so they'll just be like, I just need to get to the winter break and I'll have a rest and then it'll be fine. And so, they get themselves to a winter break, they take that break, they focus on rest and recovery. But when they return to dance after, those issues just like pop right back up or flare right back up. And that is unsurprising because they've probably not done anything to address the issue besides rest. And that is often not what injuries need in terms of their recovery, and especially those types of niggly injuries where they're often related to potentially like a muscle imbalance or non-optimal movement patterns or things like that. If we don't address those will likely just become an injury again. And so to maximize and make the most out of your winter break, that is the best time to focus on addressing some of those issues. And these might be issues that you have seen a healthcare provider for before. Like maybe you're even going to physical therapy or seeing, some sort of a healthcare provider. So you know what the issue is. It's been diagnosed and you have things to work on, exercises or like a treatment plan. Winter break is one of the best times to address these issues because your body's not being overloaded with dance training at that time. So you can really focus on addressing whatever the root cause of that issue is, whether it is a strength issue or whether it's a mobility issue or whether it is a motor control movement patterning issue, what have you. Those we still really want to focus on during the winter break. So even though I've said that first 2 weeks of a longer winter break is really going to be focused on rest and recovery, when we're talking about recovery, I am also talking about addressing issues within our body. So people sometimes ask me, they're like, should I be resting or should I be doing my physio exercises? Both. Resting and doing physio exercises. Physio exercises on their own in general is not going to be taxing enough that it is like considered conditioning necessarily. Like we kind of put them in a little bit of a different category because they're often very specific and very targeted to what the injury is or what the problem is. And so they're not at the same intensity level as like a full gym workout would be, let's say. Obviously, this falls on a continuum, and a good rehab program is going to like take you through that continuum, and eventually you're going to transition from what look like rehab exercises to what look like gym exercises. So depending on where you are along that continuum, There's some blurred lines, absolutely. But generally, if we're just working on rehabilitation exercises, we want to still be doing those even during the rest and recovery phase of our winter break. And then we're going to kind of progress that or incorporate that into the more conditioning phase of the winter break. But all of that to say that simply resting and hoping and wishing that the injury or the issue will go away is usually not going to be an effective strategy. We really want to address the root cause of it and get a handle on it. So when you go back to dance in January, that issue has sort of been taken care of and it's not causing you the same problems. Because time and time again, and I see this over summer break as well, as people say, yeah, I was having this problem, then I had the break, and so I rested, and it felt totally fine, and I just figured I needed some rest, felt totally fine, but as soon as I went back to dance, it started to flare up again. And it's generally because we have not addressed the specific issue and the loading and the, kind of like tissue rehabilitation. And so that is a really important piece of rehab. Rest itself is usually not enough. And especially with these kind of more overuse type injuries as opposed to like an acute injury. So I just wanted to throw that out as well in terms of when we're talking about how do we maximize our winter break training plans, or how do we maximize using our time in our winter break effectively, that is one of the top things that we can do, in addition to then managing our rest and recovery and then gradually reintroducing those training loads. Hopefully that is helpful for you. Like I said, I mostly was touching on longer winter breaks today. So if your winter break is shorter, go back, listen to episode 60 from last year, because we touched more on shorter winter breaks and what those should look like or could look like from a training perspective. But I hope that's helpful for all of you, especially college and university dancers who do have this longer break. We really want to take advantage of that break, but also make sure that you're coming back into the next semester of your program feeling at your best. If you have any questions or want any clarification for anything covered in today's podcast episode, please reach out to me. You can find me on social media platforms at Dance Physio Erika with a K, or reach out to me via email. My email is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, not just today, but to all the episodes over the past year. I really appreciate all your support. I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a lovely holiday season with your friends and family. See you next year.